Hello everyone, myself Purushotham, working as Assistant Professor in Department of Computer Science and Engineering, MLR IT. In this session, I am going to discuss about the final keyword. So, this is an overview of this session. So, first I will explain what is a final keyword, next usage of final keyword and initialization of final variables, and last I will explain some sample examples. Okay. So, let us get started today's session. So, final is a keyword or modifier applicable to the variables, methods and classes. Okay. So, final is a keyword. The final is a keyword and it is a modifier and which is applicable for variables, methods and classes. Okay. So, final keyword we can apply for variables, we can apply for methods and we can also apply for the classes. Okay. So, variable means as we know that there are three types of variables like instance variables, static variables and local variables. For all types of variables we can use a final keyword. Okay. So, not only that, for methods also we can apply final keyword and even for classes also we can apply the final keyword. Okay. Now we will see what is a final keyword. If you apply variables concept, what will happen, I will see. Now, final variables. If a variable is declared with a final keyword, if a variable is declared with a final keyword, its value can't be modified and we can make a variable as a constant, means that the reassignment of the final variable is not possible. Okay, means if any variable, if it is declared with a final keyword, then it becomes what the final value, means we cannot change that value, means variable value will be changed during execution of the program. But if you give the final keyword to that variable, so then it becomes a constant, means during execution of the program we cannot modify that value. Okay, so that is the behavior of the final variable. So, we must initialize the final variables, otherwise the compiler will be generate the compile time error. So, in general, for instance variables, for static variables, initialization is optional. But for instance variable and for static variables, if you are using the final keyword, then the initialization is a mandatory. Okay. So, in various ways we can initialize the final variables. Now, we will see. If you are not initialized, means it will throw compile time error. Even for instance variables and static variables, final instance variable, final static variables, initialization is mandatory, otherwise it will throw compile time error. So, as per the Java documentation, the final variable naming convention should be all uppercase. Okay. So, as we know that all variables are in lowercase. Okay. If the variable is declared with a final keyword, so it becomes a constant. Okay. Now, what is the convention of the representing the final variable, means it must be uppercase as per the documentation, Java documentation. So, all characters in the final variables must be uppercase. So, suppose if it is a multi-word, we need to use underscores to separate. Okay. So, suppose if you take an example, here I have a pi value. Now, the pi value as we know that it is a 3.14. So, the pi value is always 3.14 only. Okay. So, during execution of the program, so suppose I don't want to change this value. So, in such cases, this pi value we need to declare with what a final modifier, so that during execution of the program this value will be fixed and it becomes what, constant. It becomes a constant. Now, pi is a final variable. As per the Java documentation, it must be uppercase. You can see P is uppercase and I is uppercase. It is just a convention and it is optional. If you want, you can use a small pi also, it will work. Okay. But which one is a recommended, means the first one is a recommended. Why, means as per the Java documentation, so all final variable naming conventions are what, uppercase only, but not lowercase. If you use a lowercase also, it will work, but the recommended one is means uppercase only, the recommended one. So, initializing the final variable, as I mentioned, initialization of the final variable is a mandatory. Okay, if you are not initialize the final variable, it leads the compile time error. Okay. So, how many ways we can initialize this final variables, means in 3 ways we can initialize this final variables. Okay. So, you can initialize the final variables when it is declared, means while the declaring itself, okay, you can initialize. Okay. So, this approach is the most common. Okay, like suppose in a class, suppose assume I have a class A and here I will declare int I equals to 10. Now, it is an instance variable. So, for instance variable, this is optional. If you want, you can initialize, or if you want, you can ignore. Okay. So, suppose here I ignored initialization, here I ignored initialization. So this will work no problem. But if you declared with the final keyword to this variable, now this I becomes what the final variable. Now in such cases, initialization is a mandatory. Initialization is a mandatory. So what the first common approach means? While declaring your variable itself, you need to initialize. This is the first approach. So here I am initializing I value with a 10. And a blank final variable can be initialized within the instance block or within the constructor. Okay. So suppose if it is instance variable, okay, that instance variable you can initialize either inside instance block or either inside a constructor. Okay, and remember, whenever you are initializing the instance variable in constructor, so suppose if you have the 2 constructor or 3 constructor, every constructor initialization is a mandatory. Okay, if you initialize the only one constructor but not other constructors, and again it leads to compile time error. Okay, how many constructors are there in your program? So that many constructors, the final variables initialization is mandatory. Okay, or else you can initialize within the instance block. Okay, so suppose the final variable is a what instance. What if the final variable is a static? Okay, so if the final variable is a static variable, then you can initialize within the static block. Okay, so this statement is talks about instance variable. This statement is talks about instance variable. Means if the instance variable so suppose if you want to initialize instance final variable, either you can initialize within the instance block or constructor. If the final variable is a static variable, you can initialize within the static block. Okay, so these are the 3 ways. We can initialize a final variable. Okay, the first way, the most common, whenever you are declaring your variable, you can initialize. And the second one, if the variable is an instance variable and if you are declaring with a final, either you can initialize within the instance block or within the constructor. Okay, and if you are initializing the instance variable within the constructor, and how many constructors are there in your program, that many times you need to initialize, otherwise it will throw the compile time error. Next, if the variable is a static variable, and where we need to initialize, so inside a static block we can initialize. Okay, if I take an example, here we can see 3 approaches in one single program. Here I have a variable pi. It is an instance variable and it is declared with a final keyword. Okay, now the most common approach, whenever you are declaring a variable, final variable itself, you can initialize. So here I am initializing. This is the first approach. The second approach, here you can see I and j are the instance variable, the final instance variable. Either you can initialize within the constructor and you can initialize within the instance block. So I initialize within the constructor and j I initialize within the instance block. You can see this is the instance block. And the database version, it is a static final. Okay, it's a static variable. So the static variables we cannot initialize within the static block, we cannot initialize within the constructor. So now where we need to initialize means here you can initialize within the static block. Okay, so this is a static variable, you can initialize within the static block. So coming to a final class, means if you apply the final keyword to the class, now what is the behavior? Now we will see. So when a class is declared with a final keyword, it is called the final class. Means if a class is declared as a final, then we cannot inherit that class. So we cannot create any child class for that class. Means if any class, if it is declared with a final keyword, the further child class creation is not possible. Okay. So suppose if I take an example, so you cannot create a child class to the string class. So the string class is defined with a final keyword. Okay, means it is a final class. So final class, child class creation is not possible. If you are trying to create a child class, it will throw error. So here I have a class name is a parent and it is a final class. Now here I am trying to create a child class to the parent class. So as per the rule, the parent class is already declared with a final keyword. Okay, so if you are trying to create a child class here, so here it will throw what? The compile time error. Okay, so this is not possible. So as you know that the final class inheritance concept is not applicable, means the further child class creation is not possible. If you are trying to create a child class, then it will throw what? The compile time error. So this is not possible. So here we need to remember a few points. Every method present inside a final class is always a final by default. Okay, even if you are not defined with a final modifier also, every method is defined inside a final class is always a final. Okay, now, but the variable is need not be final. Okay, so this point I will explain the programmatically. So suppose I have a variable is a 10. Okay, now this variable is declared in demo and the demo is a final class and m1 is declared here. Okay, now inside m1 and again I am reinitializing this value. Okay, so I value is already initialized with the 10 and again I am reinitializing a value with 100. Okay, so this is a possible. Okay, means value means variable need not be final, but the method must be final, means the further child class creation is not possible. So obviously method overriding also not possible here. Okay, so the overriding of this m1 is not possible here. Even if you are trying to override this m1 method, it will throw what? The compile time error. Okay, so all these points now we will see the programmatically. So first of all, I will explain what is the final variable, what will happen. I will see. First, I equals to suppose 10. Now I will make it as a static so that I can access inside a main method also. System.out.println I. Now it is a normal variable, so directly you can access inside a main method. You can see the 10. Okay, and if you want to, you can reinitialize this value. So I equals to 100. So this is also possible. Now initially it will be the 10. Now it will be the 100. Now you can see it will execute. So if you are declaring any variable with a final, then it becomes what? The constant, means that during execution of the program the reassignment is not possible. So here I am trying to reassign this value. In such cases we will get what? Error. So cannot assign value to final variable I. So this is not possible. And if you want to initialize this final variable, okay, before that, here normal instance variable initialization is optional. You can see here system.out.println. Okay, I will make it as better. I will create a object as sample s equals to new sample s dot I will print. Now here the normal instance variable initialization is optional, but if you are declaring a normal instance variable with a final, now the initialization is a mandatory. Here it will throw out the compile time error. Variable I not initialize the default constructor. So here the initialization of the final variable is a mandatory. Now the question is where we can initialize, means you can initialize within the what? Instance block. So here I will initialize within the instance block. Now this is a possible. If you run, it will execute. And if you want to initialize within the constructor, so assume I have one constructor here. Instead of initializing within the instance block, now I will initialize within the constructor. Now I equals to, suppose let's take 10. Now this is also possible. It will print 10 now. It will print 10. So suppose assume here I have two constructors. The two constructor means the constructor overloading. Let's take here int x here, means this one is a first constructor and this one is a second constructor. And how many constructors are there in your program? Okay, so that many times initialization of final variable is mandatory. So here I initialize only constructor but not in second constructor. In such cases also will throw what? Error. It will throw what? Error. See here, it will throw error. So here also we need to initialize with any value. Like suppose here I will initialize with 100. No need to initialize the same value. You can initialize with 100. Now as per this object creation, so first constructor will be called, so it will be initialized with the 10 and it will print what? Only 10. Now you can see it will print 10, right. Now suppose if you are passing like some integer value like 1 2 3 I am passing, the 1 2 3 I am passing means, so this is the normal constructor, means 0 argument constructor and it is a 1 argument constructor. So here 1 2 3 are passing, this will be execute and I value will be get initialized with 100. Now s dot I means it will print what? 100. Now you can see it will print 100, it will print 100. So initializing a final instance variable means how many constructors are there in your program, that many times you need to initialize, mandatory. So if you are initializing in only one constructor, if you are ignoring other constructor, again it leads to compile time error. So what if I want to initialize a static variable? So again the static variable initialization, the recommended area is a static block. So here I will initialize a static block and I will initialize with 100. I am creating object to the sample and I am calling what? Si. Actually object creation is not required, directly we can call, either you can use what? The class name. So here I am using object, but if you want you can use, if you want you can call the directly I, or you can also use a class name like sample dot I. In 3 approaches we can call, it will print what? 100 100 100. In 3 ways, as we know that the static variable we can call either by using object creation, directly we can call, or we can call by using class name. So the recommended practice is using class name is a recommended practice. Now coming to final methods. If a method is declared with a final keyword, then it becomes what? The final method. Now what is the behavior of the final method means? Cannot be overridden, means the overriding concept is not possible for final methods. So if you want to restrict the implementation of a method, then you can declare it as a final. Okay now. So suppose assume here I have a class, now the class name is A, assume. Okay, now the class is having what? Multiple methods. Let's take public void m1, next public void m2. Now I have one more child class here, extends A. Now here I can override m1 and m2. Okay, so if you want you can override m1 here, and if you want you can override m2 here. So assume I want to restrict this m2 method implementation, so simply declared with a final keyword here. Okay, so m1 you can override, now m2 we cannot override. Why? Means this method is declared with a final keyword, so the overriding of m2 is not possible and it throws the compile time error. Okay, so simple. So if you want to restrict any method implementation, simply declare that method with a final keyword, so that no one is allowed to override that method. So best example here, for example, in object class we can override the methods like equals method we can override and toString method we can override. Okay, so object class is having the different kinds of methods like equals method and string method, wait method, notify all methods. And equals and toString methods are normal methods. Okay now, so we can override these methods, but so wait, notify all are what? Final methods. The final methods means the overriding is not possible. So here is one example. Here I have a class, the parent class, and I have child class. These two are in the parent and child relation. Here I am using extends keyword. Now parent is having m1 method and parent is also having m2 method. m1 is a normal method and m2 is a final method. So here you can override m1, but you cannot override m2. So why we cannot override m2 means m2 already is declared with a final. Okay, so that is a final implementation only. If you are trying to implementing the what M2 here inside a child class, here we will get what the compile time error. Okay, so this is not possible. Here it will throw compile time error. And here we need to keep some points regarding the final modifier. So the main advantage of using the final modifier is to achieve the security. Means if you don't want to change any value, like pi value I don't want to change, like 3.14 during execution of the program I want to this value remains the same. So you can use a final keyword. And if you want to stop a method implementation, so you can use a final method. And if you want to restrict the child class creation, you can use what the final class. Okay now, but if you use the final class unnecessarily, if you don't have requirement, if you are using the final keyword, so it will stop what this stopping the key benefits of object oriented programming, the key benefits like inheritance and polymorphism. So how it is affecting on inheritance means, so if you are using the final keyword to the class, inheritance concept is affecting. If you are using the final keyword to the method like M1 method, now overriding concept is affecting. So we are losing this inheritance concept and polymorphism concept. These are the key benefits of object oriented programming. Okay, so if you have a specific requirement, you can use a final keyword. If you are not a specific requirement, the final keyword is not recommended to use actually. Okay, so as I mentioned, hence if you have a specific requirement, you can use, but never recommended to use a final modifier, because it is affecting the key benefits of object oriented programming language. So coming to the overview of this session. So in this session we have covered the final keyword and the final keyword usage. What is a final variable, what is a final method, what is a final class we have discussed, and how to use a final keyword also we explained. Okay, so that's about this session. So thanks sir.